All right, everybody, it looks like we are now live. We're going to talk about Aristotle and friendship and a lot of other good stuff today, I hope. I'll also be taking questions from the chat like usual, like what we've been doing before. I'm trying out a new area of the house and stuff to stream from. So if you are in the chat and you want to say hi, or you want to make sure that make sure to let me know if I sound okay, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll kind of riff for a minute or two, and then we will get into today's topic, which is the philosophy of friendship. Um, you know, I'm going to be referencing one book the most, not a lot of page references or anything, but just kind of in general, um, the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. This is not the usual translation that I would reference if I were talking to you about Aristotle. I usually talk about the Collins one. I think it's Collins. It's from Chicago. There's two translators. Sorry. Okay, great. It looks like people can hear me, and it also looks like the chat is working this week, which is fantastic. Like I was saying, I recently decided to read a different translation of Aristotle for the first time, and the reason I decided to do that was just to kind of like push myself to see how different is it, because I'm pretty familiar with this text at this point, but just to get a slightly different idiom there, and it's been actually pretty helpful. I like it a lot. In future videos, if I mention Aristotle, I'll probably use this one for at least a little while because it's the one that I have, kept out. Um, yeah. So, oh, I see someone else. You're saying before we hear reading that book in your Kindle because I've recommended it a few times, and boy, what a good choice I've made. Absolutely, the Nicomachean Ethics, folks. I know I talk about it a lot, and when you talk about something over and over, you get a little bit worried that people are just going to think you just want to talk about like the same thing over and over or something. But I'm talking about it so much because I do think this book is a gold mine for philosophy, and it's harder than a lot of the books I'd recommend, probably because of the dialogical, not the dialogue, the rhetorical style. But I think there's just so much good stuff in that book. All right, since it looks like people are joining and it looks like people can hear me, let's go ahead and talk about what I want to talk about today. Um, like we've done before, I'll take questions in the chat as they come up, as I see them fit. And then after we kind of get through the stuff I want to talk about, we can just talk about whatever, and we can just hang out for a while as we stream today. So the topic of today's live stream is the philosophy of friendship. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk about friendship at all is primarily because I talk about Stoicism so much on this channel, and I think that the Stoics are very important. They're very useful. I can see the appeal to a large audience, and there's a reason that I read them so often as well. But one of the things that gets lost, I think, when you read the Stoics and you're not reading them really in their context and you're not reading scholars about them and you're reading kind of the popular works, is the social aspect of Stoicism. And one of the things that the kind of problematic misinterpretation of Stoicism that can be out there in the world is that Stoicism is a kind of like rugged individualism, where if you are someone who finds Stoicism compelling, you don't need friends. You don't need to be you don't need to love anyone. Love might be extraneous or useless or something, and that's couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to the Stoics. The Stoics are actually emphasize that human beings are social creatures. So we are actually, like, by our nature, social creatures. And when we talk about being by our nature social creatures, that immediately turns us to the larger philosophical topic of friendship. Now, I mentioned in one video on Stoicism recently, where I was like, don't learn about Stoicism on YouTube, read these instead. A book called The Roman Stoics by Gretchen Radom Schills. That book. That book is really about the Stoic view of friends, of family, and all of these things. Um, but the Stoics, of course, weren't the only ones who wrote about friendship in the ancient world. And in fact, probably if you're looking for the most influential treatment of the most influential treatment of friendship in the ancient world is probably Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I say this because if you look at contemporary work on the philosophy of love and the philosophy of friendship, which is a fairly thriving field, you would find that people want to talk about They'll reference Aristotle quite a bit, at least. They will at least bring up Aristotle into the conversation, where I very rarely would see someone reference Plato just for the sake of referencing Plato. And if you're reading the Nicomachean Ethics, the person that the part of the book that you want to read is this, which is book 9. Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Nicomachean Ethics has 10 books. Number 9 is friendship. And the reason that we talk about friendship so late in the book is that you have to understand what virtue is in order to talk about friendship for Aristotle, which is going to sound like you wouldn't expect it, right? Sorry, I have to silence my phone. People want to talk to me. Let me get that silence. Great, done. So, remember from last week when we talked about virtue, like what it is to be virtuous is to live according to your nature, right? And one of the things that is going to come up a lot actually here is whether or not someone who is virtuous could even or isn't virtuous could be friends with anybody. This was actually an open question for Aristotle, and he does seem to give an answer in the Nicomachean Ethics that we might find interesting. But also, if you think about these two things together, that what it is to be virtuous is to live according to nature, and we are by nature social creatures, then actually part of being virtuous is having friends. So actually, to be virtuous, one has to have some friends. Now, friends here are being understood actually very, very broadly. This can include like a spouse or an intimate partner that you are incredibly close to. In fact, on this kind of term, you do want to be friends with these people. It can include family members whom you are friends with, and then we are, close to. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what Aristotle would say about a couple of different kinds of friendship, and then what like a great example of friendship looks like when we're talking about sort of the highest form of friendship. So let's just dive right into that. So we should talk first about the fact that Aristotle makes a distinction between 3 different kinds of friends. So Aristotle defines or distinguishes between friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and friendships of virtue. So we're going to go through the first 2 first, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about friendships of virtue. So a friendship of utility is a kind of friendship or a social relation that you have with somebody where you're doing it because you get something out of it. This is not necessarily wrong. This is not actually using someone necessarily. It can be. There can be a morally wrong component to this. If you're pretending to be friends with someone because you want to use their car, or they have a pool and you want to swim in their pool, something like this, that would be morally wrong. But also, I think if you look at friendships of utility, these can include things like business partners. So if you have ever, okay, here's an example of this. So Penn and Teller, right? So Penn and Teller are comedians, they're entertainers, they're massive stars, right? I think if you go, and they've worked together for decades, and apparently they're like fabulously successful. They work very well together. I think they talk about how good they are at collaboration. But if you talk to them, especially Penn, I guess, because Teller doesn't talk very much. If you talk to Penn, they will say that they aren't friends. They will actually say that they don't actually care for each other all that much. I think they used to say it in slightly harsher terms. Now they say it in slightly lighter terms. But basically, what they meant by this was they don't have like a lot of personal affection for each other. Instead, what they do is they see each other as like good partners to work with on a common pursuit or goal. But they don't seem to care for each other as people any more than they care for any other person, right? So if they're very kind, they will be kind to each other, but they don't have like a lot of personal affection. And being in each other's company might not even be a source of pleasure for either of them, right? They're business partners. And so we call this, um, and so they would qualify as friendships of utility. The problem with friendships of utility, and the reason that you don't want all of your friendships to be friendships of utility, is that they're not resilient. Like they can fall apart, right? So when does a friendship of utility end? Well, the friendships of utility end when there's no utility. And what we mean by utility here, right, is like usefulness. They're friends, like Penn and Teller are friends or business partners because they work well together. If it ever happened that uh, they didn't work well together, then they would just stop being friends or they would stop being business partners. They would have no reason to continue this. And I think, if you can think of friends that you clearly have just kind of been friends with, essentially out of convenience, you might say, then you can probably figure out that you weren't friends with them for very long. That whatever your friendship was, it really did not last very long. So if you're friends with someone because they're rich and like you like hanging out with rich people because they do stuff, well, if that person ever stops being rich or they stop being so magnanimous and giving away all their money or something to you, then you'll just stop being friends with them, right? So friendships of utility just have a tendency not to last very long. And there's also almost kind of a lack of respect that can be there. Not always, but at least sometimes we have a tendency to turn friendships of utility into essentially turning someone into a means to an end. And then the next, so that's friendships of utility. Now let's talk about friendships of pleasure. Friendships of pleasure have at least some affection, right? So if I if I'm friends with somebody, right, and they give me pleasure, right, as in meaning I feel good when I'm around them, I kind of feel happy, and we say that in the modern sense, then it makes perfect sense, right? You all have like those friends that you had or had at some point, where they were just fun to be around, right? You just had friends that like when you were around them, it was like a good time. But we sometimes call these kinds of friendships superficial. We call them superficial just because you don't ever have big talks about like the meaning of life with them, right? You just hang out with them because they're fun. And they might view you in the same way, right? It's very like a friendship of pleasure is not necessarily bad. It can be good to be around people um, who just give you pleasure, right? Having some amount of pleasure is good in your life. But again, just like with friendships of utility, there's sort of two concerns. One is that they don't tend to last, that they tend to not be very resilient. And two, that you can turn this into almost a kind of exploitation. You can turn this into using someone as a means and not respecting them as a person. To use the kind of Kantian formulation, we are saying that there would be like you would treat them as a means or rather than as an end in themselves. That's the kind of language that Kant would have used when we want to talk about respecting someone's dignity. Right. So let's turn to the chat for a second. Talk about this here. So right, that's like learning. Bert and Ernie didn't get along off screen about Penn and Teller. I assume. Yeah, I remember the first time that I found out Penn and Teller weren't like close because they have great rapport. If you ever see them, like even though Teller doesn't talk, and I just thought like, wow, like I was almost like a little bit sad. But it seems like it works for them, right? And it seems like they just know that they aren't going to be incredibly close, but that they can be friendly, right? They can be polite, they can be kind to each other, and that they can just, work well together. And I think there is some value in recognizing sometimes that maybe you're not going to totally get along with somebody, but just knowing that you can work well with them is, pretty nice. Um, so Space Cowboy asks, the word friendship should understand it as it understood in this time. Um, so I think what's being asked here is like, has the word friendship, is it different now than it was then? Well, I would say this, at least when you're talking to philosophers, the problem is that they want to lump lots of different groups of people into friendships. So talk about your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your wife, your husband, whatever, as a kind of friend. Some philosophers will talk about having children and you should be friends with your children, right? And they don't just mean this as like a thing on top of being, um, and they don't talk about this like it's a thing on top of it. They talk about it as like this is just a type of friendship, right? It's like a subspecies of friendship essentially. And so I don't know, how broadly like other people who weren't philosophers in the ancient world would have thought of friendship or how different it was here. Though I do think they have what almost looks like a very romantic view of like true friendship when we talk about friendships of virtue, which we'll get to in just a little bit. I want to turn to a few here. So Perciv says that did Aristotle have many friends of each type? I'm not super familiar with Aristotle's particular life. there's two complications to that. Um, to that. One is that when we get to friendships of virtue, we're actually going to learn it's very hard to have friendships of virtue if you're yourself not virtuous. So that's going to be a complication that's going to make things a little bit weird to wonder, did he have any friends of that type? Right? Because we could actually ask the question, do any of us have friends of virtue? But as for friendships of utility and friendships of pleasure, it seems pretty straightforward. Almost everyone has those kinds of friends and associates. And in fact, I think this was a nice point here from Marquez, who says that it's easier for Penn and Teller to work together if they're not friends outside of work because they get tired of each other. And yeah, I think that part is right. Not every person you meet, even if you like them and respect them, are going to be people that you want to be like the deepest and closest form of friends with, right? And that could even be people that you work very well together. You know, I think probably if you have a job, you might have work friends, and that's great if you have work friends, but they're the kinds of friends maybe you don't want to tell your deepest secrets to. Um, and that's fine. Like that's totally fine. Everyone is always like a little selective about how many friends you can have because that's just natural for us, right? It doesn't mean we have to be unkind to the people that we're not, this closest form of friendship with, but it's just like a truth matter. In fact, I think if you try to have too many friends simultaneously, you try to be really deep, you're going to overextend yourself emotionally. You're going to overshare. It's actually going to be hard to form those deep and lasting friendships. So I do think that there is, a nice point here, which is to say that it's probably okay. All right, let's see. Um, that's not the one I want to put here. Sorry if this off topic. Is the meaning of physics and atoms from ancient Greek the same as it is today? That's a good question. Here, let me just answer it briefly because it's not super on topic, and we might get back to it later if you stick around, Ivan. You're here last week, and it's great to see you. Um, Sort of two things. Atoms just meaning like the smallest particles, right, or like the smallest things that the universe is made up of. One, it's kind of funny. We don't think atoms are the smallest things anymore, right? When Greek philosophers talked about atoms, they technically just meant like whatever like the smallest indivisible unit was. And the second part of it, physics and metaphysics weren't as clearly defined as like separate things as they would be nowadays. So you had like speculative metaphysics essentially. So it's slightly different, and that's just because philosophy and science were more on a continuum rather than being seen as like sharply divided. Now, it's actually not true nowadays that philosophy and science are completely sharply divided, but we tend to treat them like that in a way that um, most people now or in the ancient world would not have accepted that kind of division. In fact, for a long time. Okay, so let's see. Ernest asks, is it a good idea to attempt to deepen friendship of utility or pleasure into a friendship of virtue, or should it come naturally? So there can be times I think where you make an effort, right? If you think there's potential there. And we're going to talk about actually the kinds of people you'd want to form those deeper friendships with and whether it's possible to form those friendships with them in just a little bit. And maybe that's going to answer your question just a little bit. But I mean, sometimes you should put effort into your friendships. They do not actually always develop naturally, or they might start to develop naturally, but they take effort to cultivate. You should think of friendships kind of like we should think about everything, like a really nice garden, where it's really nice if they grow nicely in the soil, given the temperature and all of these things. But they should not be left completely unattended. You need to actually work on cultivating them. Right. I see there's a question about Siddhartha here. I'm going to save that for later, but I'll address other book related questions a little bit later in the stream. Cool. So first have asked me to define friendships of virtue, and that should bring us nicely to our the main topic here, which is like, what is a friendship of virtue? So a friendship of virtue, according to Aristotle, is a friendship which is not undertaken because it is useful. It is not undertaken because it is pleasurable. Instead, it is a relationship between two people who recognize similarity between each other, and the similarity that they recognize is actually a kind of turning towards virtue. So you actually recognize that the other person is virtuous as well. And thus, you two are aligned in the fact that you're both virtuous, you both love the same things. And this is like the precondition for loving each other properly, right? So, Aristotle will actually say, I mean, so we should just address this topic for a moment here, which is that friendships of virtue, according to Aristotle, cannot be had by what he calls bad people. In this translation, he just says bad people. We mean people without virtue, people who are not courageous, people who are not prudent, or people who are evil. Any of those, they actually can't have the deepest kinds of friendships because you're not properly aligned actually towards virtue. You actually don't like what is good. And so recognizing it in someone else is basically impossible. I mean, this is a really strong claim, but I think that we can see at least like some of the plausibility of this claim when you think at it like this. Someone who lacks virtue, let's talk about someone who's greedy, right? Someone who's very, very greedy, like habitually greedy. Well, one of the reasons it's difficult for them to be friends is that greed involves placing your own needs above someone else, right? How can you form a proper friendship with someone if you're incapable of putting someone else's needs above yours? Because sometimes in friendship, that's what's required of us. Let's go back to those four cardinal virtues we talked about last week. If you're imprudent and you don't understand your place in the world, then it seems like you just lack the general wisdom to be able to form those kind of deep relationships. Or if you're cowardly, then you're not going to be able to stand up and do the right thing when your friends would rely on you. Or if you are reckless, well, you're going to actually sometimes put your friends in danger in addition to putting yourself in danger. If you're unjust, then again, it seems like in the case of greed, you can't put someone else's needs in front of your own, or you can't have a kind of sense of mutual respect between you two because you're always putting their needs in front of your own, which itself is not healthy either. So basically, what Aristotle wants to say is that actually, I mean, let me find the quote here. This would be useful. So let me flip through the pages for just a moment. Um, he writes actually this at the end of book 9. He says, "The friendship of bad people therefore turns out to be an evil, for because of their lack of stability, they share in bad pursuits and turn evil through becoming like one another. But the friendship of good people is good and increases through their association." So notice there, this was actually a really nice point here. What happens when you are in a truly good friendship is that you become more like each other. You become similar. This is not a total assimilation of your personalities where you're all getting sort of annihilated and there's just like the one now, or it's not like the Borg, right? So, there is no mandate to assimilate or something. Instead, what it is though is that actually friends encourage each other to be more virtuous because you both want to do the right thing and you help each other do the right thing. If you're not virtuous though, and you have like sort of the wrong ideas, then you will become more like the other person, where you'll both become greedy, for instance. And then your friendship will be unstable and both of you end up getting hurt here. So friendship actually, because it makes you more like the other person, um, it can only be good for you as well if the other person is good. Um, so let's look at a few of these other questions and we'll talk a little bit more about friendship. So, can a friendship of virtue ever turn into a friendship of pleasure without putting in the work to cultivate it? I think this is absolutely right. So, even a friendship that starts off as a friendship of virtue, you both recognize in each other what is valuable, what is good. You both are oriented towards virtue, and you want to make each other better. Right? Aristotle says that actually you are. How does he put it? That a friend does something for you that you cannot do for yourself. It actually, your friend will reveal things to you about yourself that you could not do on your own. I'll say this, the probably the closest thing I have to a friendship of virtue, if I'm being totally honest, is my relationship with my wife, where my wife knows me better than anyone else in the entire world, and my wife also knows when I'm making a mistake, even when I don't know it's a mistake yet. And I think the same could be said for her, where sometimes I'll know she's making a mistake, even if she doesn't recognize it yet, and we're able to help each other. Right? That's like a really, I think that's the sign of a healthy relationship. And it's what Aristotle would talk about when he talks about these friendships of virtue. But just like how marriages can fall apart if they're not properly cultivated and they're not cared for and attended to, or if the people significantly change, so too a friendship of virtue can degrade. And you might start only liking the person because of the pleasure or because they're useful. And that is, I think, a danger, right? There is that danger there when you're friends with someone, and we kind of worry that without that that you need to be attentive, right? Lots of people will talk about this with marriages, that over time your marriage might degrade unless you put in the work. People talk about marriage being work, and they're absolutely right. That marriage requires effort in order to maintain yourself, but also maintain that relationship with the other person, to encourage them to do better, right? But not in like a forceful way, but in a way it's kind of out of mutual respect and love. Let's see. In your experience, how did you manage to find virtuous friendships? Where do you find those kinds of people? I think that partly this starts by looking for people with some shared interest to you, but think of your more noble interests. Think of the things that you like. And I think like this does not have to be elitist. It could even be, I don't play a ton of these. I've been playing more because I've been a little obsessed with Baldur's Gate 3 lately, but like let's say you're like really into video games, right? And not in a way that maybe it completely clouds your life or takes over your life, but you see it as like a skill to develop. And there is like skill in playing video games, right? And you want to like push yourself to be the best, and you're interested in excellence, right? You might make a friend who is similarly interested in that, who sees it as like virtue is or not virtue, like skill is good, excellence is good. Let's pursue it together, right? Those it's when you can find someone who wants to engage in mutual meaningful projects with you, that's where you've sort of started to be able to develop one of these deeper, better friendships. It's not just because you'll feel happy or you'll feel joyous while you're with them, though that might be the case, and that's great if you do, but also you will be making each other better through your mutual pursuit of these projects. I got lucky personally. I met my wife in graduate school. We were both working on our PhDs in philosophy. We had similar interests. We had a lot of shared interest, and that let us kind of start, right? But over time, a mutual interest in philosophy does not sustain a marriage forever. It does not sustain a true friendship for either. We both have to be interested in generally being better people. And eventually what starts happening is like you don't want to just be a better person for yourself. I want to be a better person for her, and she wants to be a better person for me. And that's really where I think things start to really click, and they start to work very well. Uh, as for more practical things, like where do you go looking for friends, we could talk about that more if people want to a little bit. But I think that's hopefully addressed like some of your question. Um, Let's see here. Friendship of virtue reminded me of a popular saying, "My true friends, you can count them on your fingers, and you'll have fingers to spare." I think that's totally right, and it's not an insult to the other people that you're friendly with to think of them as not your true friends, right? But you should think of it kind of like who are the friends you could call when you got into a car wreck, right? Who are the friends you could call when your life's falling apart? And there's probably only like a couple of people in your life. Maybe you're lucky and you have like 15 people you could call. I don't think I have 15 people, and that's fine. But because in the same way, I would think of who the people would call me if their lives were falling apart. And like I can only think of a few people I think who would call me. So what it is that there's kind of mutual reliance, right? Like I think mutuality is one of the strongest and most important words when we're talking about these true deep friendships, that it's about caring about each other in a kind of reciprocal way. Aristotle worries that if we um Aristotle worries that quarrels begin, he says. Let me restate. He says, quarreling begins between people when one person expects something and the other person gives them something different. So he describes it as like, imagine I say to a lyre player, someone who plays the lyre, um, who says, "Oh, I'll pay you double if you play all night," right? And the person plays their instrument all night. And then he doesn't hand them money, but then says, "Oh, well, I'm paying you pleasure for pleasure. You gave me pleasure, now I'm giving you this." The lyre player would obviously be mad because he expected money, right? He expected to be paid for his work. And I think, we have to make sure, like with people, that it's like the two of us in this relationship are going to offer each other the same things, and we're going to expect the same thing. So our expectations have to be aligned with reality as well. It's very difficult to maintain that with lots and lots of people. And so I think the saying from your country, I don't know what country you're from, Space Cowboy, but there is something very wise there, I would say. Um, Okay, so Joey asked, some people believe that we can't really have a pure platonic friendship with an opposite gender without romantic inclination, just like with the same gender. Thoughts on this? No, I actually think that these things are fairly separable. I think it is totally possible, regardless of who you are sexually attracted to or anything like that, that whatever gender you are sexually attracted to, you can still be friends and have platonic, meaning non-erotic friendships, right? Friendships that don't involve a sexual component there. I think it's totally possible. I have um, very close female friends um, who I am not romantically attracted to in the slightest, who I would call if my life was falling apart, right? Probably actually, if I think about it, one, but when I think about the people I would call, I have like a group of like three, right? And so that's not someone that's not a woman who's my wife, but someone else, and there's no feelings there, right? And some people are going to say, well, that's impossible. There has to be something. All I can say is after 15 years of knowing this person or something, we seem to be doing all right. We seem to be doing okay without that ever coming up. So I do think it's possible, because love, like this kind of loving of someone and also sexual attraction they get intertwined very easily in our minds, right? So maybe that's like why people worry about this stuff. But yeah. Um, so let's go on to the next question here and talk about this. Would Aristotle agree with the concept of love at first sight or meeting? I don't think Aristotle would agree with the concept of love. It's like, is that I don't actually know if I agree with it either. And here's why. Let me take a drink of this water, and then we'll talk about why. When we are talking about the kinds of love and friendship that we're discussing today, it involves knowing, if you'll forgive the phrase here, but it involves knowing someone's soul. Like it involves knowing what they value and what they love and what they spend their time actively doing. Just because you see someone and you feel a lot of attraction, I think it's very hard to call that like love or friendship in the sense that we're talking about it now. You might feel a very strong attraction to them. And if things work out well, they also are virtuous and you're kind of aligned in this regard and you're both like pushing each other there. But um, I think it's just hard to say that what we're talking about when we talk about these deep friendships is compatible with an idea that you could just see someone and just know it. Right? Okay. So let's see. What if your friends suddenly annihilate yourself when you are in trouble? Are they your friends? I don't exactly know what you mean annihilate here, but if do you mean like if your friends like abandon you when you're in trouble, right? That's indicative of you being in a friendship of utility or a friendship of pleasure. Because basically, when things aren't convenient for them anymore or things aren't fun for them anymore, they're not there for you, right? That's not what we're like when we're looking for those deeper friendships of virtue. That shouldn't happen. They should be resilient and they should be able to persevere through those hard times. But friends who are only there when it's nice, they're not there in your down times. They're not the kind of friends that we're really looking for when we're talking about these deep friendships that Aristotle would talk about. I've only been talking about Aristotle, but the Stoics say stuff like this too. Musonius Rufus, he talks about brothers sometimes, and he means this both as like natural brothers, so people you are related to by blood, but also the brothers of like your comrades or your fellow students and lovers of philosophy who are lovers of wisdom and want to pursue it together. And he basically says that those brothers are worth more than any wealth. They're worth more than anything. But those are the kinds of people who stick with you, right? It's why when we talk about family, we talk about blood being thicker than water, meaning they're going to stick with you. Is like the phrase that we often. That's kind of the meaning behind the phrase that we want to say here. Um, okay. Let's see. It says there can be different kinds of love, right? Partner, spouse, children, friends, etc. Why do people so often conflate love with sexual feeling? Yeah, so there's lots of different kinds of love in this regard, or we might think of it as like, um, that there are many different kinds of relationships that we properly have, right? And it seems like we should talk about that. We can talk about them all kind of in general to talk about this kind of mutual respect and admiration, things like this. But there are different kinds of like duties that you have. Like I have particular kinds of duties or obligations to my wife. I have different obligations and duties to my son. Um, so we don't want to conflate them. That part is certainly right. Um, okay, so here's Philippe asks, do you know of ways to balance self-preservation and self-alienation, considering people around could be abusive, but also considering being alone is terrible? Yeah, so basically, I think what you're talking about now is like the risk that we face when we try to have friends, right? That there is a risk there when you try to have friends where you're putting yourself there. Like, how do I put this? Um, when you try to be friends with someone, you open up the possibility of getting hurt, right? It's the same if you're in a romantic relationship, right? There is the possibility of getting hurt. So why breakups suck so much, right? Um, but I think uh, what I would say here is that what you need to do is like when you're figuring out um, like early on in a friendship, right? When you want to avoid like this abuse, like what you're doing there by even exploring a friendship is getting away from the idea of self alienation, right? You're no longer alienating yourself. The worry is that you're now putting your well being into someone else's hands, at least partly, and that's the risk. And I would just say here, like if someone's abusive to you or something like this, like the kinds of things that you're worrying about, that shows that they're not a person that you need to be around to be friends with. And that's easier said than done. But what that shows is that like those kinds of friendships or those kinds of relationships don't turn positive very suddenly, right? If they're negative now, they tend to stay negative. And that's where self-preservation has to kick in, where we're at then saying, how can I preserve myself out of this? And sometimes that just means extricating yourself from that relationship. Though it's hard, it's easier said than done. And a lot of it depends on particulars that I can't comment on. Um, oh, real quick, procedural question, Will, how much advice? We've been streaming for about 40 minutes, and we've been talking about friendships. We've made it through Aristotle's threefold distinction between friends. We got friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and now we are talking about friendships of virtue, which are those deeper kinds of friendship that Aristotle wants us to pursue and to consider. And I would say the Stoics as well. Um, okay. So, Joel, if we define love as willing the good of the other, does that explain how friendships of virtue are resilient? At least partially, yeah, right? Because so that formulation of love is at least as old as Thomas Aquinas. But um, that a love is actually not just like having an affection for someone, but looking at someone and wanting what is good for them. And I think there we can see at least a little bit of why those friendships are resilient in the sense that the love that we're experiencing isn't dependent on us, right? It isn't dependent on how we feel now. It's about actually what we want for them, and so we want to stick with them even when times are tough because we love them, and love here means wanting what is good for them. Okay, let's look here. Ernest asks, Jared, what do you think about the idea of going through hardships with your friends? The only way to develop strong friendships, and strong friendships, the same as a friendship of virtue. What I would say is that the strongest form of friendship is a friendship of virtue. It is hard for us to achieve those, and they're limited, but they're the most resilient forms. They're strongest forms. They're the kind that tend to last, right? And what you're saying is, what do you think about the idea of going through hardships with your friends in the way that develops strong friendships? I do think that mutual hardship can be a way of sort of accelerating the ability to form a bond, right? It might not be strictly required. And you might say that it's like actually a really good test of a friendship to see how it can last later on through some hardship, right? So it's a really good test of a friendship that when you call and say, I'm in trouble, can you help me? That person comes and helps. Um, when a friendship has formed in part through mutually helping each other go through some kind of hardship. We think of like war buddies, people who are in a war together and then are friends for life because of this. You might think it's because like they've proven this relationship to each other, right? So maybe this is yeah maybe that answers the question. Um, okay, what would the Stoics say about old friendships that are beginning to end as time goes on? I think that the answer to that is basically that the Stoics would talk about those, like they would talk about any good thing which fails to endure, any good thing that fades over time. So many good things don't last forever. Sometimes a friendship, even a deep one that means a lot to us, does not last. You fall out of touch. You're not able to really actively maintain it, maybe just due to worldly circumstances. Maybe it has nothing to do with the two of you changing like this. And I think that the Stoic answer to this is like to say, you should look at it, you should appreciate it for what it was, right? So we can look at it and be grateful for the things that we had, even if they didn't last as long as we'd like, right? Or even if they have failed to continue. Um, that we should never though. Well, how do I put this? Because something didn't last doesn't mean it wasn't good at the time, right? Or it wasn't good and it hasn't had a good, solid, and like strong effect on you, right? So that's something to keep in mind. That actually, even if a friendship fades, even if it was a great friendship there, it was still good. It was still good to have it. And it's better to have had a friend and then maybe that friendship fades eventually than it would be to never have a friend at all because you do grow, you do learn something, and both of you should benefit from it. Yeah. Okay. So, Sean, um, oh, just procedural question here. Billy said, what recommended text should we read? The text I would recommend based on this is book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So that's so it basically, book is kind of a weird term here, but Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is made up of 10 books. Each of those books has a number of chapters, but the whole of book 9 is about friendship. And so if you wanted to read something, go and read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Okay. So Sean asks, like, coming from the Epicurean school of thought, so I'm not as familiar with a Stoic should view friendship. May I ask how a Stoic would rank each type of friendship? Even Okay, so I totally lost that comment for a second. Or are they each separate things? Well, they are separate things as in the sense that they can be distinguished and ranked. I think that the Stoics would agree with Aristotle in the sense of these friendships of virtue being the most important. Friendships of pleasure are like fine in the sense that pleasure is not contrary to our nature for a Stoic, so having some pleasure can be a good thing. Um, Friendships of utility, I think that we should. I kind of even eventually want to stop calling them friends, even if they're fine social relations. You shouldn't count your happiness on them. That's certainly true. But I'm not sure what the Epicurean said about friendship. So if you are someone who knows more about Epicurus, then I would I would want to hear it. Right. So I don't know this. Um, yeah. So Will says that if I found a position where my IRL friendships are relatively weaker for me, even some of my parasocial relationships feel stronger in some cases, it isn't what I'd like. And I understand that's tough. The hard thing about, especially the internet with these parasocial relationships, um, the hardest thing about that probably is that it can't be mutual, right? So even someone like I have two, there are right now like 50 people watching this live stream, right? I can't know each one of you personally. Even if I met you in real life, if we met and we had a beer together or something like this, I'm sure we would get along, right? Or there was potential, but I can't be friends with all of you simultaneously, and it'd be very hard. I can't stretch myself like this, so we can't have that kind of mutuality, and it's like that for anyone there. Um, so I would say though that my so then the question is like if you want good friendships, they have to be in real life, or at least even internet friends can actually be like this. Internet friends can be real friends. I've made friends who I consider very, very close who have helped me in some hard times on the internet. In fact, right before this, I was like in a group chat with them. I have a couple of friends like that, not a lot, but like I have three, and we've been in a 4-person group chat for years at this point. But I am so it doesn't have to necessarily be someone that you see every day, but it does need to have that mutuality, right? Okay. Oh, Will also asked, doesn't Aristotle say that no one can be happy while he lives? Well, Aristotle quotes Solon, I believe, who says that count no man happy until he dies. The idea is that actually your happiness can be taken from you in life, according to Aristotle, by having a bad death or by leaving a bad legacy. Aristotle is actually concerned about having bad children, children who disappoint you after your death. He uses Socrates as an example of this. That Socrates probably isn't happy, all things considered, after he died because his children were disappointments, uh, which is like one of the earliest insults that I remember reading. Okay, let's look through here. Um, is there Stoic knowledge on living a life without friends? So while the Stoics would say that it's good to have friends, it might even be the best possible life involves friends. In general, when we talk about like a life without friends and how to endure it or how to live through it, I think there's a case where you might want to read like Marcus Aurelius a little bit, where he talks about retreating to the inner citadel in those later notebooks in the Meditations as a source of peace. It's like you can always go on vacation in your mind, is basically the view that Marcus has. But also, just think back to Epicurus, like when he talked about the dichotomy of control, that there are some things that are in our control and there are some things that aren't. And how someone else treats you or how someone else views you or even likes you is one of those things which is overall out of your control. And we can learn, and somehow we can learn to be content, even if it is actually quite difficult. These are great comments so far, folks. I'm really, this is very, very interesting. Um, So, Space Cowboy asks, for Stoics, a friendship of pleasure may be a preferred indifferent. So, to remind you, a preferred indifferent is a thing which isn't strictly speaking necessary for your happiness, but is consistent with your nature, like pleasure. Pleasure is one of those things that for the Stoics. And I think in the same way that a friendship of pleasure is a preferred indifferent. It is not necessary for your happiness, but it's a good thing to have. It's not contrary to nature, and so we say that's a preferred indifferent. It's a good use of Stoic terminology, Space Cowboy. Thank you very much. Um, okay. If only so Joel asks, if only good people can have virtuous friendships, does that therefore exclude the majority of people from having true friends? This is a case where things are a little bit different if you're answering as an Aristotelian or you're answering as a Stoic. So, uh, Aristotle thinks that not everyone can be virtuous, right? That many people, in fact, aren't virtuous and that they have no hope of becoming virtuous because their social conditions don't allow them to be virtuous. If that's the case, then many people, in fact, most people, can't have true friends, according to Aristotle. If you are a Stoic, though, you believe everyone always has the capacity to be virtuous. And if that's the case, then everyone always has the capacity to have real friendships. And it's within their capacity now to have real friendships, and that they could begin very, very soon. Okay. So let's look here. Ernest is saying, are you familiar with the quote that for a friend with an understanding heart is worth no less than a brother? Is it the same as a friend who shares your virtues? I think this is similar here. What they're saying is like a friend with an understanding heart, like this is a friend, this is someone you're not related to who understands you, who knows you for who you truly are. And this is one of the things that occurs when you're in like a truly great friendship. Um, Also, a few people are apologizing for like commenting too much or something. You are totally fine, everyone. You should comment as much as you want on these. But reminder, we do these weekly now. And let me just take a little break to talk about some of the future live streams. Then we'll go back to answering some questions, and I'll go through some of the questions I've been starring as well. So feel free to keep putting questions down in the chat. But let me talk for just a moment. So I'm going to keep doing these weekly on Thursday nights. Themes Thursday night works out best for me, works out best for a lot of people. Next week, I'm streaming actually with a guy named Mike. He's a fellow booktuber. He might be, and he's in the channel Mike's Book Reviews. So, which you might know if you like fantasy or science fiction stuff. Mike and I are going to chat about fantasy novels mostly. This is going to be a much more lighthearted one next week, but it should be fun. Probably hang out for like 2 hours, something, just have a good time. And then I'm going to go back to talking about philosophy for a while, but I am going to try to bring in guests maybe about once a month. In September, I have one guest lined up already, but he and I are going to live stream on like a Saturday. It's going to be like a Saturday morning. And I know Saturday mornings aren't the best times for everybody, but they are, I hope, useful for people who are not in the States. So it will be like 9 a.m. Central Time because I'm in Texas. And that should make it a little bit easier for maybe people in Asia who want to join, or some people in Europe or something. That's my hope. Okay, cool. Let's go through and let me talk about the topics for a second. So we're going to keep talking about philosophical stuff, about friendship. I want to talk a little bit about some of the lesser known Stoics. I want to talk about Seneca's essay on the shortness of life, which is tremendous. And I might open it up to just do like a pure Q&A stream like next month or something. But we'll see. I'm going to have to keep seeing what other people say in these streams. Let's answer this question. What is Mike's channel? Mike's channel is just called Mike's Book Reviews. He's got about 98,000 subscribers right now. In fact, Mike wants to get to 100,000 soon, because we all do. We all want to get to 100,000. And so if you don't subscribe to Mike, but you subscribe to me, go subscribe to Mike. It'd be really nice. He's really close. I feel like he's going to get to 100,000 in like a month. Maybe 2 months. So we could help him out. We could help bump him up a little bit if a few people would go and subscribe to Mike. In fact, I think he's live streaming right now talking about a science fiction novel. He's talking about stuff here. So anyway, V says, I had to catch this one though. It's almost 2 a.m. here. I keep missing them. Yeah. So that, I think that's why I want to do some on like Saturday mornings and stuff. I would do other times as well. I would even just stream more, but I have a baby, and just the time and figuring out when I can do it is a little bit difficult. Okay, cool. So let's go back and answer a couple of questions. Well, the only one I have to start here is this from Nick, who says, have you read Siddhartha? And if so, what are your thoughts about it? Any other books, recommendations dealing with similar topics, fiction or nonfiction? Either are great. Okay, cool. Great question. I love any question that's just a book recommendation question, as I assume you would know. Sorry, I was just looking at the other questions here. So I have read Siddhartha. In fact, if you go and look at today's video is a little video called 8 Classic Books You Can Read in a Day. And it's just a book list, recommendations of some classic books that are all under 200 pages. I kind of had to define what a classic was in my head, and I decided it had to be a notable or culturally relevant work by an author who has died and who has been dead for at least a little while. That was basically the definition. So you couldn't choose Cormac McCarthy, even though he's dead. Siddhartha was one of the recommendations, because in fact, is Siddhartha... it's a little too far. I think my wife picked it up off the stack here. So Siddhartha was one of the recommendations. I do recommend it. I think it's great. Everyone should read Siddhartha. The themes, though, if we're talking about like overcoming grief, pain, sickness, suffering, despair, in the video, I drew some connections to the Stoics themselves. That the Stoics are one of the people. Musonius Rufus, that one should disdain hardships, is a great book for this. I would say if we can think about any novels that have to do with kind of the overcoming of pain and reaching something greater, they would be the best picks. And right now I'm blanking just a little bit on the best ones. For some reason, the only book that's coming to mind, which is not a good recommendation, is The Wheel of Time, which is a multi-volume fantasy series that mostly involves the prolonged and extended torture of the main character. But maybe that's not exactly the thing that you're looking for. If I can think of something else, I'll bring this up. Okay, so let's see. Question here is Seneca's on shortness of life in Letters on Ethics. Seneca's on the shortness of life is not in Letters on Ethics from Chicago. It's from Hardship and Happiness. That's where that volume is contained. You can also just buy On the Shortness of Life as its own text. I think it's published by Penguin, just so you know. So Felipe asks, do you constantly have to reimagine your reading through a modern lens, or do you read first and then reflect on them? If by this we mean reflect on the readings, you're always reflecting on them. What I try my best to do when I'm reading these texts is to put myself in the mind of the author. That is not always possible, and it takes a lot of work, but that's at least what I've been trying to do. So I try to understand Aristotle as at least a Greek would understand him, and then I try to incorporate him as a modern American, because none of us are pure historical Stoics. None of us are pure historical Aristotelians. We've all learned too much. Our worlds are too different. We gain quite a bit from studying them and from following them intellectually, but we will always have to make modifications. What I would love to know your thoughts on why read the classics by Italo Calvino. Calvino is one of my favorite writers. Greetings from Chile. Well, hello from the States to Chile. I have not read that book by Calvino. I like Calvino a good bit though. I have a lot. I've been going through all of my books because I actually got rid of a huge number of my books recently just to downsize the collection. And I kept all my Calvino, I believe. If I got rid of Calvino, I'll be sad, and I'd have to go buy them again. So I don't think I did, but I kept all my Calvino. But I have not read Why Read the Classics. I would, I need to check that out though. So that's good. I believe Aaron was mentioning Lord of the Rings as like people who suffer, but also the Lord of the Rings is a really great example of a good friendship. One of the best portrayals of friendship in fiction, in my opinion, is Samwise and Frodo, who that true like love. They have like true love for each other as friends. It's very powerful. And they're united in a common and good mission, right? So it's great. Okay, so what sorts of things can a person do to cultivate a virtuous friendship? What is the work that these friends do? Well, in part, one of the things the work is done is just like the work of maintaining your own virtue, right? I mean, choosing what is right. And but the other thing though is showing that real kind of like love for someone that goes beyond it being convenient, right? It's that love that's not convenient. That's like the first, I think, big thing. And oftentimes it's hard to do that the first time. It's always risky, right? Because you put yourself out there. Okay, so just asking some book questions here. I'm gonna call you Imwer. I finished The Wheel of Time a week ago. Any similar recommendations? So, as anyone who watches my occasional videos about fantasy novels knows, The Wheel of Time is my favorite fantasy series, and I have previously declared that it will be my favorite fantasy series of all time. But I'm currently reading something that I think might top it one day. So we'll see. But I love The Wheel of Time so much. It's so good. If you're looking for that, so when you're asking for Wheel of Time, you're asking for big epic fantasy series. And one of them that I'm reading, this is not the one that's going to top Wheel of Time, is Malazan by Steve Erickson, Malazan Book of the Fallen. In fact, in September, when I that Saturday morning live stream, it's going to be with someone who's a fantasy guy as well. We're going to talk about those books. The books that I'm reading currently that I think are really great, that might be kind of up your alley if you're into that, but it's got like a science fiction bent to it as well, is Sun Eater by Chris Rocchio. But I had to think more about like, if you like Wheel of Time, go read these. Obviously, some people are going to say Brandon Sanderson because enough people, because he finished the Wheel of Time, and Sanderson did a great job finishing the Wheel of Time. It's in my opinion, it's his best writing. It's his best work was when he finished the Wheel of Time. The fact that he actually wrote The Last Battle so well, tremendous bit of writing. Sanderson could never write another thing in the world. In fact, you could burn all of his Cosmere books, and I would still say, wow, what a great fantasy author, because he did such a good job finishing the Wheel of Time. Which I hope answers the question from Ivan here. Have you tried reading any Brandon Sanderson books? Brandon Sanderson actually, the Cosmere made it onto my top 10 of fantasy novels when I treat the Cosmere as a whole series. I think nowadays, if I were to do that list, I know I only did it a few months ago, but thinking about it, Sanderson would not be on my top 10, but he's fun. I treat Sanderson as like pure fun reading. I I haven't read Yumi and the Nightmare Painter yet, but like I'll read it. I'll read it once I get around to it, and I'm sure it'll be fun. When the fifth Stormlight Archive book comes out, I'll read it. I'll read it immediately. I'll read it over the week that it comes out because it's it's fun. He's a fun fantasy writer, and again, he did a great job finishing the Wheel of Time. Okay, this is a good question from Ernest. Hypothetical question: if two historical persons met, one from ancient Greece, another from ancient Rome, while having different virtue standards, would they be able to have a friendship of virtue? I think there's enough of a core of a shared understanding of virtue here that it's entirely possible. Obviously, it is certainly not impossible to form deep friendships across cultural divides, right? Um, in part, actually, I can test this personal experience. My wife is from China. She moved to the States for grad school, and then and so they are. I mean, we have slightly different conceptions of like the world, right? In part, just because we came from very different cultural backgrounds, but we still were able to form this. And I mean, I think you find by and large, human beings share a lot and they have more in common than they do that's like totally different or totally separates them. And so I think that in your hypothetical, they could still form that deep friendship if they were willing to do the work and there were maybe a few other necessary preconditions. I'll answer Ernest Hemingway in just a moment. But Skates Cowboy also points out that Marcus Aurelius is the perfect example of enduring grief, and that's a really good point. Marcus lost a lot of kids. Um, it was normal for children to die, right, at the time, or it was at least more normal, and so it was he knew what it was like to suffer in that regard. So you could even look to Marcus there. Okay. Okay. Ernest also says Dostoevsky. The question is just Jared, Dostoevsky? I guess the answer is yes. I love Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is great. Obviously, Crime and Punishment is like one of my favorite books ever. I think when I made a list, it was like number 2. You know, those top 10 lists are always a little artificial because things are naturally in flux. But I love Dostoevsky. So great writer, great person to learn from. So he's one of the great. So someone asked, "Oh, do you read Ernest Hemingway?" I just learned about his life story. If the question is, have you read Ernest Hemingway? The answer is yes. The question is, do you read Ernest Hemingway? Meaning, like, are you actively reading Ernest Hemingway at any time? I haven't read Ernest Hemingway in at least a decade, so I should get around to reading him again sometime. But he's pretty low on my list to revisit, even though at one point he was very important to me as a writer. I'm someone who I think, not to the exclusion of other forms of literature or other places, but like I do love American literature. I think that considering the United States has kind of only existed for like 200 years, the amount of high quality literature we've produced is pretty astounding, especially when you consider how bad a lot of the media that we produce is. We've produced a lot of really, really great writers. And obviously, if you're talking about American literature, Hemingway is going to be part of this. Just from Billy, just by the way, love your children from the Philippines. That's great. Thank you for joining from the Philippines. That's awesome. One of my favorite things about coming on to the stream and just like talking to people is that I'm going to talk to people from all around the world, and we're just like united by the fact that we want to talk about books, or that we would just like want to talk about philosophy. And like, how cool is that? Just like, how freaking cool is that? Ryan saying that he had a hard time reading Marx's Meditations, but he just can't connect. Feel guilty as a Stoic philosophy fan. Look, if you're having a hard time reading that text, maybe right now. Well, okay, I see you have the rest of this question. You say you're having a hard time geeking through it. Do you think there's value in forcing you through a text? Sometimes there is value in forcing yourself to finish a text. In fact, it's a skill you're going to want to cultivate eventually because you're going to read hard text that you're going to want to quit. That said, it also just might not be the right book for you right now. Right? It might not be the right book for you right now, and that's okay. Just try something else. Just try something else for a little while. Take a break, or create a reading plan. How many notebooks are there in the Meditations? Like 11 notebooks or something. Create a reading plan. Say each week for the next 11 weeks, I'm going to read one notebook. Break it up, those notebooks however you'd like, or just do it for like on that Saturday, you'll read the notebooks. It'll take you an hour, something like that. So if you want to force your way through it, find a way to sustainably work towards it rather than just like being miserable, right? But if you need to put down a book, it's okay to not finish a book sometimes. I do it all the time. I choose not to finish her. I think on BookTube lingo we're supposed to say DNF, right? But I DNF quite a few books, and that's fine. I also regularly read part of a book, put it away, and then come back to it a month later and pick up where I left off. I seem to be able to do that and can still roughly remember what's going on. Other people might have trouble, but at least that has not been a problem for me. Um, Will, if you are interested in reading groups about philosophy, let me just give a little pitch. In the description of this live stream, there is a link to my Discord. Totally free. It's open. People organized reading groups. I think all of the reading groups fizzled recently, and we're going to try and start up some other ones in the future. But it would totally make sense to me if that Discord had like a Stoicism reading group or something like that. I would chime in occasionally. I cannot commit my time to doing it regularly just because of a lot of stuff going on. I'm writing a book. I'm doing these live streams. I'm making videos. I'm working my job, and I'm taking care of my family. So it's hard for me to commit. But other people there also want to talk about philosophy, and it might be a good way for you to try. Right? Space Cowboy asks, "What about Faulkner?" Well, Faulkner is also a titan of American literature, but he's not one that I'm not super familiar with. However, I like stream of consciousness writing, and I like that kind of writing that kind of overwhelms you. So I think I'm disposed to like Faulkner quite a bit. All right, folks. It looks like things are kind of dying down a little bit in the chat, and I would I'll stick around for a few more minutes, answer some questions. For instance, Ernest, your question about philosophy books recommendations cover masculine and feminine. I actually don't know of any good ones that come around. So sorry. You might want to just like look around. Space Cowboy, you say life's too short for wasting time finishing books you don't enjoy, or that is what I think for at least fiction books. Somewhat, yes, but sometimes we force ourselves to read a hard book because we know it'll be worth it. That's the only exception I would carve out there. Sometimes there are books that you don't enjoy in the moment, but you're glad that you finished them. So just keep that in mind when you are choosing not to finish a book. Sometimes you should force yourself to do it. It will be good. Oh, Joel's going to read The Intellectual Life. Oh, enjoy The Intellectual Life. You will. Yeah. Okay. Let's look through a little bit of this. And we're asked, what was the series you think might top Wheel of Time? The one that I think might do it for me is Sun Eater by Chris Rocchio. I'm too early on to know, but all I know is that he's checking a lot of boxes. He's very clearly inspired by Dune and by Gene Wolfe, and I love Dune and I love Gene Wolfe. He's inspired by Roman history. He's just writing in a way that's very compelling. I'm only reading the first book currently, and I've been told that's the worst book in the series, and I'm loving it. So that's why I say Sun Eater. But that said, for the time being, at least Wheel of Time is still number one for me. Wheel of Time rules. Robert Jordan. What a guy, Robert Jordan. Okay, one of the questions here is, politics seem to create non-virtuous people. What do philosophers say about this? Well, Aristotle has a very high view of politics. Aristotle thinks politics is the highest art. So it is actually, it's really important, politics in that regard. But that's like helping run a city, and it's helping you live together. The reason that politics doesn't produce virtuous people now is that we treat politics like a team sport. Like literally the people who get too into it just like want to watch political news in the same way that people watch ESPN. And that's not a way actually to produce virtue in yourself. I don't talk about politics on this channel, so that's about the most I will say. I'll just say this: watching too much political news is probably bad for your soul. So, yeah. Okay. So, any tips on balancing pleasure reading with necessary reading? Just make a little bit of time for pleasure reading. Don't force it, but just like do try to actually make the time. You're saying when you have free time, you just watch Netflix. I would suggest to not watch so much Netflix. That's probably the easiest way. Netflix is passive entertainment. Reading is always active, and it's a Netflix will always be there. Watching some TV is fine. I watch like a little bit. I watched Silo recently on Apple TV. Loved it, by the way. It was great, but I have to be really careful about how much YouTube I watch, how much TV I watch, just because it's so easy to watch so much of it. Suddenly, you don't have time to do anything good. I've been asked, what's the hardest book you've ever read? The Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel, or maybe Being in Time, but I like Being in Time a lot more, so I'll say The Phenomenology of Spirit. And Sean recommends actually listening to Seneca or other things as an audiobook. I would try that. Actually, reading some of these things as audiobooks can be good, and there's free audiobook versions on YouTube and stuff, or like LibriVox for these old books. All right. One last thing here that I would say: have you ever thought about writing a book? I have. I'm working on 2 projects right now. I have a novel I'm working on, and I have a nonfiction book I'm working on. I have a feeling, given my channel and stuff, I should write the nonfiction book, because I think it's about philosophy and it's about books and things. It's about stuff that my channel's about. But lately, my attention has been focusing on writing the novel, which is kind of falls into that nebulous area where science fiction and fantasy start to blur a little bit. But I think most people, if they were going to read anything here, they'd probably actually want to read the nonfiction book. Is there a way to access your dissertation? You mentioned it once, and I was curious on the subject. You could find it on the University of Connecticut's database, probably, which is open to the public, I believe. It's not great. I mean, there's parts of it that I'm very proud of, but dissertations are hard to read. They're dry, so it's hard. But you could try. You could try finding it. Just think from Juan Carlos here. I thought about people wanting to look intelligent because of the reading, speaking, talking about philosophy. I think you make it accessible to get people to improve our lives. My gratitude to you. Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I really, really appreciate that. Oh, Dirty Mike, thank you. Thank you for the super chat. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Actually, super chats really help sustain doing this. So thanks a lot. This question is here. Reading Solenoid. There's someone in my Discord who's been talking about Solenoid like a lot, and I haven't read it yet, but I think it's got to go on the list of books I need to read. I am currently challenging myself to try and read books that I own, to try to get through every book that I own that I haven't read. If you count ebooks, that might never happen, because someone recently helped me get free legal copies of ebooks of like 500 of them or something. He helped me just download and format them properly and stuff. And I don't know when I'm going to read all 500 of those, but if we're just kind of about physical, I'm trying to work through those. I will get to Solenoid eventually, though. I've heard really good things. There's also this other fantasy, science fiction series I want to read by authors Ada Palmer, and I've been sort of meaning to read that. It's lately it's lately been easier for me to read fiction, like science fiction and fantasy, because I'm often reading at night. Sometimes I have a baby in my hand and I'm reading on a Kindle. It makes it harder to read philosophy. So I've been reading more stuff like that. Okay, last question here, and then I'm going to have to log off, folks. From Ivan. How does one go through self-help and productivity nonfiction books? They can be so dry and repetitive. A lot of those books don't need to exist. A lot of those books could have been a good blog post, and you would learn one good lesson from them, and that's it. There is a very, very popular productivity book that everybody talks about that I really think could have been seriously a blog post. That book is Atomic Habits. It did not need to be as long as it was. And it's only like, if you listen to an audiobook like I did, it's like 3 hours long. It could have been 30 minutes. I would say those are the kinds of books that if you feel like you're not getting anything out of them, just stop reading them. Just stop reading them. The only reason that those books are worth reading is if they help you do something that you want to do. The moment that they become frustrating, or the moment that they actually don't help you do that, they're not fulfilling even their stated purpose, right? Their stated purpose is to help you be productive. The moment they're not doing that, you can just stop reading. All right, folks, thank you so much. This was great. It was a good time. I will see you next week, and we'll be on with Mike. So take care, folks.